This talk is actually geared towards more misinformation about parental alienation. And to start at the basis, a lot of individuals get confused with alienation and they might construe it with estrangement, which can either be a natural dissolution of the relationship between parent or child or child or any other type of relationship. It can result from developmental changes, people drift apart. It can be because the other parent isn't involved in their life, or even if a parent's abusive, they may drift apart naturally. Triangulation, this is where you see high conflicts in the family. The child is caught in the middle. They're trying to appease both parents. The example was given this morning with the panel about a child doing their ballet performance, and they're looking at which parent trying to appease, and they can't perform well. That's an example of triangulation. Parental alienation, we no longer have triangulation. That power control changes and they align with one parent, so you won't see them in triangulation. That being said, you may have hybrid cases where someone is estranged and then the preferred parent capitalizes on that to engage in alienation to drive that wedge even further and deeper. So anyways, anybody who's familiar with research or anything on parental alienation is that we tend to have a lot of pushback on what parental alienation science is. They call it junk, they call it pseudoscience, it's bogus, it's been debunked time and time again. Anybody come across this in any of your research? Those who are targeted parents trying to find out, is what I'm experiencing valid? And then you're hit with this type of information saying, no, it's not real, it doesn't exist. And so this is something that we as researchers have to fight. We want to do new research to focus on prevalency, interventions, how to help people, but we're stuck putting out fires. A big, major, cohesive proponent or against parental alienation is that there's this term that it's junk science. There was an article published to congressional hearing in the US that called it a junk science. In addition to that, there's also the claim that it is pseudoscientific, that even if it isn't exactly made up or junk science, it's more aligned with those views of people who believe the earth is flat, birds aren't real, the night stars have been replaced by TV screens. It's a pseudoscience endeavor. So some of the consensus they have is that parental alienation overall has a lack of empirical studies, that they claim that there's very few to little research that has been done on the topic. The research that has been done, they also add in additionally that it's not robust, it's not good quality science, it's that junk garbage. That we have poor methodologies, that we don't know how to conduct science, that maybe we flunked out of science school, and so we're just doing the best we can on the side. They also state that parental alienation isn't really a scientific domain at all. It's actually a legal thing, and that you shouldn't trust scientists. It's handled in the court. And then additionally, there's that issue of it being pseudoscientific. So there have been past assessments of parental alienation. One of the most popular ones that I see cited and quoted by people who are critical of this research is by Saini's et al.'s article in 2016. In this one, he used an assessment tool called GRADE, where he went through and he assessed the quality of parental alienation research. He did about 58 articles that he reviewed. He found that they weren't scientifically strong. He did find that there was a consensus in parental alienating behaviors, but overall, there's no substantive evidence about parental alienation research. There are some issues with the GRADE assessment tool. One, it's primarily designed to assess and see the value of interventions. As if you're familiar with parental alienation research, we started out in a greening and then a blossoming field, and we didn't focus too much on interventions. We focused more in the scientific community on theories, on concepts, phenomena, domains, and different attributes of that. So that's not something that's very typical of behavioral science research, so GRADE isn't adequately applied in this situation. Something else to keep mindful about GRADE and Saini's application of it is that he did not include other types of studies. He did not include what we call qualitative studies. This is where we ask somebody, tell us about your experience. Explain in detail what you're going through. Tell us about how it affected your life, and that was excluded. This is very rich, detailed information that we as scientists use to know what is affecting individuals. In addition to that critique, there was another analysis of parental alienation research done in 2020 by Marquez et al. And they used a tool called Prisma. Prisma is a fantastic tool to be transparent about what you're doing, as well as to be consistent in what you're doing. Prisma is used to help you identify articles for research and make sure you're using that same identification for each article. It is not used to identify whether or not they are all of high scientific rigor. In response to this, Harmon et al., this was with Demosthenes, with Jennifer Harmon, and a few others, they did a complete systematic review of the state of literature on parental alienation. Where are we at? What do we know? And in their assessment, they identified over 200 peer-reviewed articles. They identified many books, many writings, many legal cases that talked about this. After their assessment, they identified that these studies crossed 48 countries. Nearly 40% of all literature on parental alienation has been published after the year of 2016. It meets 3 criteria for the maturation of the field. This is that we have this expanding body of literature. It's not just a very niche area. We are now delving into other areas. Has been that shift from qualitative studies to more theory-driven quantitative testing, as well as mixed methodology where we combine different methods to research. And that there tends to be over a scientifically trustworthy knowledge base. Any type of peer-reviewed research has to be reviewed by other people who are experts in the field, and those who generally publish in parental alienation studies tend to publish in higher impact journals. These are ones that have higher quality, they're more likely to be cited. This were studies that crossed 10 languages. However, they did have a limitation of their study. The research needs to be evaluated on the scientific quality. So even though they saw what the trends were, what studies were being published, where they're being published, how often they're being published, they didn't actually check to see if it is junk science or if it is pseudoscientific. As that was published in 2022, I would probably amend this from saying that 40% of literature has been published from 2016 to about half of all the research we have on parental alienation has been published in the last 10 years. So the purpose of my study was just go ahead and build on the experiences of the Harmon et al. Review. I wanted to look at first, is it of high scientific rigor? Second is, since we saw that graph that we saw a transition to more theory-driven empirical research, has research improved over time? Perhaps there is some validity to our critics who say, when you first started out, it was somewhat dubious, maybe enhanced over time, so that was a second hypothesis that I had posited. I did have a research question. This is a difficult topic to assess, what is pseudoscience, but I wanted to see if we can somehow determine whether or not parental alienation research is pseudoscientific in nature. And then next, a big critique of those who don't like parental alienation. They say we can't agree on what it means, that we don't have one set definition. So I wanted to see, do we have a general consensus? Overall, do we agree on what parental alienation research is? So I mentioned Prisma earlier, how that's a fantastic way to identify articles, to be consistent and be transparent. So I used Prisma to identify what articles should be included in my protocol for this research study. I collected every peer-reviewed article that I could find and have access to from the very first publications all the way up until March of 2023. And then I needed a tool that can effectively appraise these type of studies, both quantitative and qualitative that Saney left out, as well as mixed methodology studies. And then I needed to evaluate the general state of pseudoscience in the field of this published research. So following the same protocol, I used the same method that you will find in the Harmon et al. Review. I used 4 databases to try to identify these articles. The first one is going to be PsycInfo. It's a very common search engine that we use as behavioral scientists to identify research. The next one that we have is Medline. Some of the work that we do is used as interventions, as diagnoses by medical professionals. So some research may be found in a Medline database, which is published more by medical professionals. For anybody who's familiar with legal search engines, we also use Westlaw. These tend to be studies and cases that are published in a legal database. They can include court opinions. They can also do any type of peer-reviewed research that is done by judiciaries, legal scholars, and so forth. The last one that I used and still had access to would have been the Vanderbilt repository of database. This is a collective of research on print alienation that has been collated into one central source. I have checked this database recently. It doesn't seem to be up and running, but at the time it was available to me. Hopefully PSG can get it back up for us, and that is usually managed by PSG. So my next step in this was to go ahead and identify and collate each article. Any article that was a duplicate that showed up in more than one database was removed and deleted. We did use the search terms print alienation and print alienation syndrome. That way I could be consistent with the Harmon et al. Review. We also included the year of publication, the authors, the time that it was published, as well as where it was published at. And as you can see here with the X's, this would be indicative of this is a repeat article. It was mentioned somewhere previously. So Clementine is the same article found in multiple databases. That way we weren't duplicating our responses. Why do we want to do that? Well, if I'm trying to assess scientific rigor and I keep using the same articles over and over again and they're strong, I'm going to overinflate my results. To be transparent, to be honest, that needed to be avoided. So this is the Prisma flowchart that is used. This is what Marquise et al. Used to identify whether something was scientifically strong or not. As you can see, this is very limited in functionality. But this does show you where I identified the studies, how many duplicates were removed, which were 11 of the total, the ones I found from the Harmon et al., ones that were from books, from review papers. I included any type of study that was peer-reviewed. If anything was behind a paywall that I didn't have access to, that had to be excluded. If anything was in a different language, I did obtain an English version copy or one that was translated. If I could not get a translation, it was not included in the research because there would not be an adequate way to assess the scientific rigor if I'm not familiar in the language. So of the studies that were identified to be included in my assessment of if this is good scientific rigor, 65 or 41% were qualitative, 71 were quantitative, and 20 were mixed methods. Basically, 65 or 41%, those were those open-ended questions, getting the feel for people's feelings and experiences. The 45%, the slightly higher percentage, that is more analytics, more statistical analyses. That's our quantitative data, that's our measurements. In PA research, especially after 2016, we see the stronger transition to quantitative methodology. That's why you see that more prevalent here. And then my favorite, the mixed methods, that's just combining the two. So you can use both a qualitative assessment and a quantitative assessment in your research of print alienation. In addition to the majority of the articles being published and peer-reviewed by a cohort of experts, an additional 20 were identified as dissertations or theses. The reason why I included a dissertation into my study is that they still have to go through a peer review process with their committees and their review boards. So they still have, from what we see, the same rigor of passing into scientific quality. So next, as I'd mentioned, I had to find a tool that could adequately assess the quality of scientific research. I mentioned the drawbacks of Prisma being used as well as grade. And in 2012, Hong et al. Had begun the development of what they call the mixed methods appraisal tool. It is a way to identify if qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methodology is of good scientific quality. This was sent out to several different experts in several different fields. After several iterations and feedback, a later version was released in 2018. And as you can see here, there is the screening questions is, are there clear research questions in the research? Does the collected data allow the addressing of research questions? I went ahead and I added a third question here for screening, and that is to see, is it consensus or appropriate for the study? Is it one that actually targets parental alienation? In addition, we have qualitative, which is the qualitative approach appropriate? Are the data collected methods adequate to address the findings and the answers? Are the findings adequately derived from data? Is there interpretation of results efficiently substantiated by data? Is there coherence between qualitative data sources, collection, analysis, interpretations? And then this also breaks it down by the different types of quantitative studies that we have: randomized, non-randomized, descriptive, as well as the mixed methods. We would then go through and code it as a yes. Does it adhere to this? No. Or if we can't tell, if we're unsure, we'd have to go ahead and mark it that way. So to assess this, I had a group of 6 coders. This was divided between 4 graduate students or doctoral PhD holders or 2 undergraduate students. They independently would go through a third of the list and they would code each one of these questions. As you can see with the example here, they'd answer as yes, no, or not sure. Afterwards, we'd come back and we'd do what we call a kappa correlation. We would just to see if we're on the same page. How closely are we aligning with our agreement or disagreement of whether or not it fits this criteria? After we would do the kappa correlation, we'd see if we need to do what's called a calibration. We would go through training, we'd recalibrate and reassess, and then we would go ahead and code the remaining questions on here. If there were any that were marked not sure, we would meet together with a third independent arbitrator, and we would argue through what would be the correct response for that question. In addition, any questions that we disagreed on, if someone marked yes when another person marked no, we would use the same arguing process where we'd have a third independent arbitrator to help facilitate the discussion until we came to a theoretical consensus of what the response should be. All the data and all the coding responses that I have, this is made available online, both in the article as well as on Open Science Framework website. At the end, we would have a total score, and this would be the total number of yeses. Any yes that was above a 4 to a 5 would put it in the 80% range. Good quality science is determined to be anything that's about 60% yeses or above. For the mixed methodology, this would require answering yeses to the mixed method questions as well as the other categories that it falls in. So this could have a total of 15 yeses, and this followed the same method of breaking it into a percentage to see if we could assess if it's above 60%. After collecting the data and analyzing the information, I went back through to see if we could identify if parental alienation is pseudoscientific. First, we had to know what is pseudoscience. In philosophy, several scholars had talked about what's called a demarcation problem. It is very difficult to delineate when does something pseudoscience become scientific and vice versa. Where do we draw that line? And the consensus in philosophy, as this is not a scientific question, it's a philosophical question, is we don't know. It's really hard to say when does it stop being pseudoscientific, when does it start, when does it stop. However, there are several guidelines that they do provide that you as individuals and other researchers can use to see if what you are reading is pseudoscientific. Do they make extraordinary claims without evidence? This can also include evidence that is minimal or even exaggerated. Do they say that the family court systems are being paid off to make money off of the abuse of children? We asked 2 people, 50% said yes. Is it unfalsifiable? Do they not provide a way where we can go through and test to see if it holds up to scientific truth? Another thing to keep out or keep in mind of is, does it lack any connectivity to other research? Do they just post their own opinion or their own data as scientific fact? Or do they build on the shoulder of giants, other people who have published in the field or similar fields? Has it been reviewed by other experts in the field? Have other people put their eyes on it to see if it holds up to truth? If there are any criticisms to the work that they are doing, do they make any corrections? For example, when we coded the data, if we disagreed, we'd meet, we'd arbitrate until we came to an agreement. The article is published in open access. Other people can submit their feedback and criticisms. We have to go through a peer-reviewed process. We have to make adjustments to revise and resubmit. Do these articles also go through any self-correction? Do they overuse ad hoc hypotheses for negative findings? For anybody who's not familiar with scientific research, an ad hoc hypothesis is a hypothesis that you conduct after you've already collected the data and ran your study. This can be problematic because the study needs to be designed based on your hypothesis. With the hypothesis, I'm going to choose which tool to use, the mixed method appraisal tool. I'm going to identify how many studies to be included. I need to run what we call a power analysis to see if we have enough statistical power to identify the phenomenon that's occurring. If I come up with a hypothesis after the fact, I don't have a study to adequately test for that. And then the last one, this is one that you are most likely familiar with. Do they overuse anecdotal evidence? Have you come across any articles where they say, we met with somebody and there was a false claim of alienation, therefore alienation doesn't exist? Been speaking with mothers, and mothers tend to be the victims of this, and it's made up. They tend to over-rely on these personal stories to drive this emotional response. They don't rely on the scientific data. For my study, as I could only looked at articles that were peer-reviewed, I did anything that included I did not include the extraordinary claims of the evidence, but one, did the study lack peer review? This was automatically included as those were the articles I identified. Were results published in non-scientific journals? This can include dissertations. Did the study lack reliable standards? I assessed this using the mixed method appraisal tool. I have the answer of what my findings were there, but I'll get that in a little bit. Did the study make extraordinary claims without evidence? This was assessed by the mixed method appraisal tool, particularly questions 1.5 and 4.5. Is there coherence between qualitative data sources, collection analysis, and interpretations? And the second question, 4.5, is the statistical analysis appropriate to answer the research questions? So this lends itself to whether or not it may potentially be pseudoscientific. So my results. I found that parental alienation research is actually of high scientific rigor. I was hoping for anything that was above a 60%. We ended up finding that it was well above 60%. Additionally, as it has been said that parental alienation research has grown over time, we've seen a greening, we've seen a blossoming field of the study. You saw that graph earlier, that about half of all research has been published in the past 10 years. It was logical to hypothesize that it has improved over time. However, I did not find that that was substantiated. I did not see that the scientific study of parental alienation improved over time. This is a good thing. This means that if it was high quality now, it was also high quality 10, 15, 20 years ago. So this is something that you can take home and bank on when people claim, oh, that was published in 2000, you can't trust it. That is not what we had found here. For the most part, we also found that parental alienation is pseudoscientific. I'm never going to say that every study on parental alienation is pseudoscientific or isn't pseudoscientific. Like I said before, it's hard to draw that line. I'm not going to draw that line. From the guidelines that were provided for us, no. Overall, it is not pseudoscientific. And then the last one was, is there a general consensus defining parental alienation? Each coder had to assess each article and see how they do what we call operationalizing the term, how they define parental alienation. The general term or consensus they have is that parental alienation occurs in a family, generally with high conflict, where one parent undermines the relationship of the child with the other parent, and that's done unjustifiably. So there's no reason for that to occur. So for the first hypothesis, for qualitative studies, that received a mixed method appraisal tool average of 0.75. Like I said, that's above the 0.6, 75%. That is of generally good quality. Quantitative studies, as we would expect, do better at 88%. Mixed methods do the best. It's combining qualitative, it's combining quantitative. There's more work that goes in. Understandably, it's going to perform better. That had a high score of 0.92. So the overall average was 0.84. So generally, research on print alienation, out of 0 to 100%, 84% is the score that we give about the quality of research. This is well within the line of research that is published in other fields, subparticle physics, medicine. We are not outside the norm here. Like I had mentioned earlier, a 60% would have been happy for me. 80% is well and above that. The second hypothesis, as I mentioned, the one that was unsubstantiated, has it improved over time? So I found that there was no difference between the year the study was published and the quality of science. This was performed at the 0.05 p-value. It was near zero, which means there's basically almost no existing correlation between the two. It doesn't matter when a study is published and its scientific rigor. To follow up to that, I wanted to see if there was going to be what we call a monotonic trend. So I ran a Mann-Kendall's test. This does not require normally distributed data, which is great for whenever we're assessing the quality of already published data, not data I collected myself firsthand. The sample size has minimal impact. Even though I had 156 articles I reviewed, which is a decent number, it's not impacted when I do the monotonic assessment. And this is also useful for when you have extreme outliers, such as case studies, as well as things that don't fit the norm within our data and science. My results indicated that there was a negligible descending trend of the mixed methods appraisal score, as evident by my Kendall's tau of negative 0.04. It's a very small number, a very slight decline. Basically, that means that no, it has no effect on the data. There's no way that we can finagle that to say anything different. This is a graph of where most of the studies fall. The reason why it's so delineated and symmetrical is because it's rated usually on questions. There's 5 questions that usually have yes. It puts it those nice little categories, and then as well as that we have the year. And anytime you run data by year as well as a 1 to 5 scale, you're gonna see it distributed like this. But as you can see, the average line on the right, that's the 80%. Most of the articles fall above 75%. I was shooting for 60, it's well above that. We did have a few articles that fell far at the bottom that were very poor quality, not many. Do keep in mind some of the scientific articles that we use in our assessment do come from our critics who do use pseudoscientific and junk science to assess print alienation. So in addition to ones that we publish on our side, some of the work that is published by our critics also fall down at the lower end, as well as there's a couple articles published by critics that are also of high quality. I'm not going to say that our critics don't know how to do science. Some of them do, and they do bring a lot to the table. So did study lack peer review? No. Every study was included. So according to that pseudoscientific guideline, we met number 1. Were results published in non-scientific journals? Mostly no. 87% were published in scientific journals, with the remaining being dissertations. Did the studies lack reliable standards? No. We assessed the reliable standards. We found that they were of high quality. Did the studies make extraordinary claims without evidence? Mostly no. Those were assessed by those 2 questions I had. Only 8 studies failed those questions, receiving a no or an unsure response. And 93.3% of studies received a yes for those questions. Is there coherence between qualitative data sources, collection, analysis, and interpretation? And then the second question, is the statistical analysis appropriate to answer the research question? And the majority, 93.3%, were in agreement for that. Yes, I can go back to the questions, or do you want me to do it now?
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you don't want me to interrupt you like I already did.
No, we can go back. I will be honest, this is my first time ever presenting research, so thank you for being patient with me, and I'm more than happy to get your questions and feedback.
Okay, thank you. I'm just curious if you know what generally, I mean,
We got a mic for you, hang on.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, appreciate it.
why we need the microphone.
I'm just curious if you know, what did the good science teach, or was there a trend, anything that you remember? And what did the pseudoscience, what did the good critics teach? I guess what I'm...
So one article that comes to mind that was of a critic, I'll answer that question first and then backtrack, that was of good science, is that there was an article published in 2019 by Rowan and Emery. And they claimed that parental alienation behavior doesn't cause a child to reject the other parent. In fact, it causes what they call a boomerang effect, where if a parent's engaging in parental alienating behaviors, that child's going to say, you're bad-mouthing their parent, that's not right, I don't want to be around you. That sounds counterintuitive to parental alienation theory. They did have some dubious ways of how they analyzed the results with the factor analysis, but they did correctly identify that in some cases, or a lot of cases, when parents do engage in parental alienating behaviors, they're not always successful. Sometimes it does drive a wedge between them and the child. And this is also discussed in court. Anytime that anybody engages in parental alienating behaviors, not only can it potentially hurt the other parent in relation to the child, it also hurts the relationship between that parent and that child. So intervention, of course, says educate them, tell them not to engage in those behaviors. They can be damaging their own relationship. Does that help answer that second question?
It's something that's interesting, yeah.
Okay, and then your first question, I wasn't sure if I understood it correctly.
I saw some studies that were like 0.92 rigour. Did you see any trend of what those studies taught?
Yes, so those studies, they are going to use random assignment. They were more likely to be mixed methods. So in order to be mixed methods, they had to respond to these questions, as well as they also had to be a qualitative study, and then they had to be one of these three. And anytime that you do mixed methods, there was more steps you had to go through, so they ended up engaging in more of those outcomes. Additionally, they were what I like to call, they avoided questionable research practices. So they were transparent in their hypotheses. They generally pre-registered their studies, so they had their studies time-stamped and documented on a website that you can't go back and change, and then they adhered to their protocol. In addition, they were open about what type of statistical methods they use. I didn't have to guess. They also talked clearly about where they got their sample. Can you tell me what you do for a living?
I'm a lawyer, parental alienation lawyer.
Yeah, so they provided me with the evidence that I needed to identify whether or not they were telling the truth.
So I'm curious if you want to share, like, what did those studies enlighten you on parental alienation? What did they bring to the table?
Oh, what did they bring to the table?
Yeah, what did they teach?
So did I read each of those that were high quality, and what were they saying?
Yeah. I guess that's
That's 156 articles. So some of the ones that I find, the ones that they teach, the ones that were of high scientific rigor, they talked about very common behaviors as well as symptoms that children experience, which type of interventions were effective. Those who had a lower score didn't really, they over-exaggerated the results, or it was questionable. I don't know if I could trust what they were saying, so they received a lower score. It's kind of hard to answer that question because some people do bad science and it aligns and agrees with what we know on parental alienation. So just because they agree with us doesn't mean they did good science to get there. So they may have been telling us the same thing as the good science. So I think if you're asking, is there a way to identify if a study's good or it's bad? One, go online, find this link, look at what I found. That may be able to help you. I think the biggest tip that I can give you, I know lawyers like, what's the shortcut, what's the trick, what's the easiest way to get to the point, and then I can build off that. What's that nice little snappy soundbite I can use? If it's published in a scientific journal that has an impact factor above a 1, the higher the better. The impact factor means that that article regularly publishes research that is agreed upon by other scientists, not just on parental alienation, but in other fields. So the higher the impact factor of the journal, that's going to be better for you. So we call that a JIF, Journal Impact Factor.
Thank you.
I think that helps get at what you were
That's
trying.
really interesting.
Okay, yeah. Do you need a mic?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Real quick to that point, did you identify journals that consistently publish substandard, like Meyer publishes in certain journals that are questionable, that might have papers are in the same journals?
Yes, and there are some journals that they only like to publish articles that are counter print alienation. There are journals which I call pay to win. You pay money and they'll publish your research without even reading it. So they will have a lower impact factor. Be mindful of those type of journals. We call them predatory journals as well in science. So yes, like I said, if they're not going to peer review the article is more likely to have questionable standards, is more likely to have a lower MMAT score, and as you already surmised, it's going to have that low impact factor. Okay, I think I'll continue with the PowerPoint. If you have any questions, feel free to jump in, but great questions. And I apologize, this is very stats heavy, can be boring for some groups, so if you want anything to be clarified, just let me know. Where did I leave off? Okay, so the research question. So the last one was, is there a general consensus? Do we, who study print alienation, do we generally agree on the term? Critics say we don't. We don't know how to define it. We keep flip-flopping, we vacillate in our responses. We found in the research on print alienation that 91.1% of people who publish research on it agree on what print alienation is. 8.9% they were inconsistent. Maybe they hit half of the marks. Maybe they were completely off base. In addition to that, for those who were inconsistent, who weren't in line with how we define print alienation, they still had a good scientific score of 86.1%. And those who were consistent was slightly better, 86.2%. Ignore the 0.1, ignore the 0.2, that's basically the same. Generally, the science is good. If people are publishing in good journals, it's going to be good science. If you ever want to, I can develop another training to help identify dubious science. I teach a course at the University of Malta for graduate students that we talk about questionable research practices. So there are some limitations to my study. Like I said, being a poor grad student, I wasn't able to pay $45 an article. So if I couldn't get it for free, it was not included in my assessment. Also, if I couldn't get it translated in English, sorry, as an American, I speak only one language, so I could only do studies that were in English. My study also did not assess gray areas of the literature. So a gray area is a parent who writes this book about their experience. Somebody who's not a scientist but still collected excellent data, maybe through a survey, those would not have been included as well. They do provide valuable information. They should be included in future research if we need to assess the rigor again. That's something to be mindful of. It's also limited to what's available and is therefore subject to publication bias. What does this mean? Scientific journals like to publish something that's new and exciting. So if a study has already been done before, they're less likely to publish it. Anytime you conduct science, you need to redo the study over and over again to see if it holds up in different scenarios. Additionally, if there's not a significant finding in a study, journals don't like to publish that. That's publication bias, and those are included in my study. An example of a finding that's not significant that can be left out is when I found out that there's no change in the scientific quality dependent on the year. If that was all my study looked at, a journal was likely not to publish that. It's still important information to know, so sadly that could be left out. In the future, people should consider using both the mixed methods appraisal tool as well as other ways that they have to evaluate the science going forward. And my study, of course, bridges the gap between behavioral, law disciplines, policymakers, to help develop these inclusive protocols. Future studies, they can incorporate multidisciplinary approach in their methodology. I mentioned Saney, I mentioned Marquise earlier about their criticism of print alienation research. They were very strict of how they approached it. They weren't willing to adapt their methodology, which to begin with, they didn't have good assessment tools. We have to be willing to adapt with the research as it moves forward. Great, I have one more slide. So just to recap, according to my assessment, we see that there's not just moderate but a high level of scientific rigor. Like I said, this article has been published, it's open access, it's freely available, you can use it in your court cases if that's where you use it for. It doesn't matter when it was published. If you're using studies from decades ago or just recently, you should still have a general trust that it's good. There was not enough evidence to establish published research as pseudoscientific. Despite what critics claim, we're not showing it to be pseudoscientific junk science. This coincides with what was published in the Systematic Review by Harmon et al. In 2022. And this assessed those various changes. My findings were only partially consistent with Saney. Like I said, overall, he's critical of the science of parental alienation research. Remember that date, 2016, that is more than half of the research has been published since that, so he doesn't even count for most recent research. The part that we do agree on is that we see that in the research there tends to be a good consensus on what parental alienating behaviors are. So he did find that there were consistent trends in that. Parental alienation, it affects a lot of people. It affects everything from interventions, from outreach programs, advocacy, the work that you do as a lawyer, and it affects the lives of individuals. It can be very damaging when we constantly hear this bombardment of messages that say it's not real. You can't trust the science on it. The science is out. Like I said, I reviewed every single piece of peer-reviewed publication that I can get my hands on since the inception up to 2023. I have complete trust in this.